Yeah. Hello, YouTube people. I think you're joining me. I'm going to verify that in a second here over on my Safari browser. Welcome, welcome, welcome to the people who are coming into the Zoom chat. Hi, Craig, Nick, Robert. Excellent. Yeah, this Zoom platform is so nice. So let me go ahead and check and make sure I'm showing up. Yeah, I'm over here. Okay. So I'm saying hello. I got a couple people over starting already to watch at YouTube. So maybe I'll wait till a few more people get there before I do the formal introduction to today's show. Stuart is there. Hello, Stuart, over at YouTube. Excellent. And welcome, as I said, and thank you to those of you who are joining me over at the Zoom platform, because the people who are over on Zoom right now are my patrons and show supporters who make this possible. So thank you very, very much. Got Mark Boxster. I was thinking if I took the usual slot where I typically get to do a show with Huron Brook, because he's traveling right now, he can't do it, that maybe you guys would have time and also the inclination, because you're in a habit of watching a show at this time, that you would come over and join me. So I'm hoping that I'm right. And I thank you, those of you who have decided to join me over here for your Saturday. This is a news sandwich. And if you guys are not familiar with news sandwich, because you watch mostly me with Huron Brook, news sandwich is my idea. It's sort of a spin-off of the original idea of my show. The original idea of my blog and my show was to look at the state of the American sense of life. It's named after the essay, Don't Let It Go, which Ayn Rand wrote in 1971 to talk about the American sense of life, the American subconscious way of coming at the world, its implicit philosophy in effect. And the implicit philosophy of Americans is reflected in the attitude that they have about the world. And that implicit philosophy that Americans have, what she calls the American sense of life, she wrote in 71, had so far at least protected us from totalitarianism. It had staved off totalitarianism. And she talks in there about a number of different characteristics that Americans have. They see themselves as ends in themselves and not as the means to the ends of others. And in particular, they don't see themselves as subservient to a state. They have an attitude about the world as auspicious as a world in which they can create the life of their dreams. They admire success and achievement. They respect money. The making of money. They don't resent people for having money. There's a number of characteristics. They have initiative. They don't just keep to their own job, head to the grindstone or whatever. And if there's a problem, they will try to jump in and solve it. They have initiative, unlike Europeans. So there's a number of characteristics she talks about in that essay. And I was really inspired by it. And I was curious of, to what extent is that American sense of life alive and well? And so I named my blog, Don't Let It Go. And so I think part of it too is I feel myself the struggle for keeping the American sense of life alive in me, right? And this is how we're going to get to the news sandwich in a second, what news sandwich is. So when I decided to start a podcast, I just did a spin-off of the name Don't Let It Go, call it Don't Let It Go Unheard. And, in that series of shows, I have sometimes returned to the idea of the American sense of life. But one thing you could see that set of shows is doing is making explicit and applying the ideas behind the American sense of life, in part to help maybe keep the American sense of life alive, in part also because, even as Rand wrote in 1971, you can't just have philosophy implicitly and hope to actually stave off totalitarianism and authoritarianism. You're going to have to eventually make it explicit in order to defend all of the ideas necessary to protect the American way of life, protect freedom, protect the individual's ability to guide his or her life by their own judgment and achieve goals and happiness in the world. All of this requires actually an explicit philosophy. An implicit philosophy isn't enough. So that's what I've been doing. And along the way, I came up with this idea for News Sandwich. News Sandwich, what I'm going to try to do today, and I've got an eclectic mix of stories for you. I've got the title, Vagueness and Vilification, a couple stories involving vagueness and one in vilification right in the middle. Can you believe the vagueness are the good stories? But yeah, I'll get to it in a minute. So with News Sandwich, my idea is you sandwich the piece of bad news that you're just trying to digest and deal with and figure out what you maybe should do about or think about with respect to the bad news. You sandwich it between two pieces of good news. And you do that to make the bad news just a little bit more palatable, that you can deal with it better. And also because, I mean, we can choose to focus on selectively good things in the world as well as bad things. We don't have to always dwell on bad news. A lot of the major news networks and a lot of the clickbait websites that you've got out there, they would love you to just be scared and horrified all the time. But in particular, now we've got Trump as president. We've got this rise of nationalism, fascist nationalism around the world. And they thrive on fear and making you think that everything is going to hell in a bucket immediately. I felt the need to sort of return to this format. And I had originally done it only in a blog. And I decided, okay, why not do the show? Why not do shows this way, where we start out with a piece of good news, then we sandwich in the bad news, and then go back to the good news. I've talked before on prior episodes of News Sandwich, because I've done this a couple times, this format, about what is my standard for good and bad news. And those of you who know me, you know that I am a follower of Ayn Rand's philosophy, objectivism. But the short way to put this, if you're not really familiar with her views, is I look at the news to ask this question: is this piece of news auspicious for the ability of human beings like you and me to guide our lives according to our own judgment? Are we going to be left free to choose what goals to pursue and how according to our own best judgment, so long as we're not interfering with anybody else's ability to do this? So long as we're not infringing on other people's rights, what are our prospects for being able to do this? What does this piece of news contribute to our attitude about our prospects for being able to live this sort of life? So that's the idea behind News Sandwich, my long-winded introduction. But again, I hope and anticipate that I've got some people joining me here today in this time slot that you haven't been here before. I'm going to go over to the Zoom chat, and I'm going to give the Zoom chat a bit of priority today. I also sometimes know that I have got some show supporters joining me over at YouTube, and I'll try to, if I remember who you are, single you out as well. I've got one patron who asked this question over in the Zoom chat. You said in one Patreon message to contribute questions to the monthly Patreon Q&A. And he said, I thought it's for those who contribute at least $5. Now, the way that the Patreon Q&As work is this. If you are a buttered coffee patron, so that's $20 or above per month, then you have priority for the Q&A. But as you know, I'm in on the ground floor here. So the chance of all of the questions being exhausted by the butter coffee patrons, it depends how creative they are on any given month in sending me questions. But there's a good chance that the $5 and above patrons, the chocolate patrons, are going to be able to contribute questions as well. And those are the people that I solicit questions from in advance. Of course, if I don't get enough of those, then any other patron is going to be given priority over non-patrons or non-supporters. And then after that, if I'm doing the patron Q&A live, which I will do, I'll stream it live and I'll give you guys all an invite for Zoom and everything, then you can throw a question in live as well. I cannot be the live question snob that Yaron is already, because I don't yet have Super Chat over on YouTube. So in terms of live questions, I can't give priority, for example, to people who put a dollar amount on the questions that they're asking. Eventually, I hope to do that. I think I've got about 350 subscribers that I need to go over at YouTube. They have a dual requirement at YouTube. One is a certain number of hours, and then also a certain number of subscribers. So it's looking at the stats, that I'm probably going to reach both parameters at about the same time in terms of number of hours watched per year, and then also number of subscribers, but we'll see how it goes. So in any event. Yeah. So submit your question. You don't know how many I'm going to get from anybody else, but as I said, I'm going to go in the priority order. First, it is those buttered coffee patrons and supporters. Thank you very much. And as a thank you, I give them priority for up to 3 questions for each patron Q&A. And then after that, I go to my chocolate patrons and then everybody else. And as I said, patrons will always get a priority over non-patrons. Yeah. Yeah, Yaron couldn't make it today, so that's why we're over here at mine. So let's jump into the news sandwich. So what have I got for you today? I've got Vagueness and Vilification, which itself is sort of a vague title. So I hope you'll forgive me that I did that to you. But the first story that I have is actually a Supreme Court case, and the topic is vagueness. I don't know if you read about it this week. I'm wondering if a lot of the media just really didn't talk about the case that much. When on my Twitter feed, it was big news. I think, I have some law geeks that I follow on Twitter, some really awesome law geeks. So like Tim Sandifer, for example, was really excited about this case. What I'm holding right now is just Gorsuch's opinion in the case. The opinion was released this week. It's Sessions versus Dimaya. I believe Dimaya is how you pronounce the name. I've only read about the case. I haven't, haven't actually heard any podcast or any other broadcast about it. What the case is about is this. There's this guy, Dimaya, and cases take years to get through the court, right? So Dimaya was somebody who, had immigrated here, and he was already a lawful resident. He was given, legal residency here in the United States. And the Obama administration wanted to deport him. And the reason they wanted to deport him is because he had apparently committed a crime that amounted to, in California, burglary. But burglary can encompass a whole lot of things in California, and that's one of the things that this case is about. So there is a section of our immigration law that states that if someone who had been, say, a legal resident was guilty of certain types of crimes, that person could be deported under our immigration law. And the law lists specific, certain concrete crimes that if you were guilty, you could be deported. And then in addition to that, it has some sort of a kind of a catch-all at the end, a list at the end of it that talks about how the crime involves violence in a certain way. It's very vague. It talks about the crime involving violence. And so then the question before the court is California burglary a crime that involves violence in the required way so that this guy Dimaya could be deported under the current law? So there's 2 pieces of law. There's the federal law of immigration. The federal law of immigration says you can deport this guy if he's guilty of a crime that involves violence in a certain way. And then the other piece of law is the California law of burglary itself. And so then the question is, how do these 2 interact? And do they interact in a way such that the law is vague, such that Dimaya was not given fair notice that he would be subject to deportation if he, committed the conduct that constituted the crime of burglary in the state of California? So that was a question before the court. And in the lower court, just before the Supreme Court, had been the Ninth Circuit. And the Ninth Circuit had said, no, you cannot deport Dimaya because he wasn't given fair notice. And one of the requirements of rule of law, and therefore of due process under our Constitution, is that somebody be given fair notice of the crime that they have committed and what the penalty is going to be. So that was the Ninth Circuit. So Sessions goes ahead and appeals. But again, this is a case that originated under Obama. Obama wanted to deport this guy. You can imagine, though, that, of course, a Trump administration's under Sessions, who's been particularly aggressive in California to get people deported. to the extent that the law will allow. You can imagine, of course, that they were very eager to follow through on this and make sure that he was deported. But nonetheless, the Supreme Court held with a, kind of a, I mean, it was a majority, but what you've got is you've got 4 justices signing on to the court's opinion, and then you have a concurrence from Gorsuch agreeing in this case that Dimaya was not given fair notice, that the law was too vague. And therefore, if the law is too vague, it doesn't satisfy the requirements of due process and you cannot deport. Why is this important? Now, there was this whole debate on my social media feed about whether you should say that Gorsuch is the swing vote and how was he expected to vote in the case and all of that sort of stuff. And I agree to a certain extent that to talk about anybody as having the swing vote maybe isn't very helpful. But it is the case that you can look at a justice and say, okay, well, given his particular judicial philosophy, his philosophy of adjudication, how he thinks judges should decide cases, that you can sort of make a prediction about how he might rule on a particular case. And with Gorsuch, there probably were a lot of people who expected, because he is a Trump appointee, that he would go ahead and vote along with Roberts and Thomas and other conservative justices, right? He would go ahead and vote to overturn the Ninth Circuit, to reverse the Ninth Circuit and deport Dimaya. But instead, he said no, that the due process clause of the Constitution does actually require fair notice, and that in this case, that was not given. Even though, and we know this, right, about Gorsuch, that Gorsuch has been put in there as the originalist. It just turns out that his originalist analysis of the issue differs from Thomas in particular. Thomas is the one that he discusses in his opinion. So it's a little bit surprising. Now, what does the opinion consist of? The opinion consists of, first of all, Gorsuch asking the question, is fair notice a requirement of due process of law in our Constitution according to the original meaning, the original, and again, I think he's an originalist along the lines of Scalia, what they call original meaning, not original intent. And if you really want to get in the weeds about that issue of what is an originalist and what's original meaning versus original intent, I highly recommend the writings of Dr. Tara Smith. She has done a lot of work on originalism, and she's got it in her book on judicial review, but also in her published law review articles. Some of that you could find online as well. But the original meaning originalists, which is how I read Gorsuch's analysis here, he wants to say, at the time of the writing of these words that are effective as part of our Constitution, what was meant by them? What did they refer to? And in particular, he asked, does due process encompass this requirement that somebody be given fair notice of the law to which they're going to be subjected to some sort of penalty? Are they going to incur a deprivation of freedom? Are they going to be deprived of property in various ways? Does due process require fair notice? And in particular, does fair notice, of course, require that the law be clear, that it not be vague, it not be ambiguous? And in the whole first part of his opinion, he went through the analysis and talked about, what was required at the common law, that you should be given at least the same due process that was existent at the common law. What did Koch say in Blackstone and the authorities at the time? And he concluded that, yes, not surprisingly and thankfully, right, that the rule of law and due process requires that we be given fair notice of the law to which we are subject, and the law that if we violate its terms, we would be subjected to some sort of penalty. Again, whether it's a deprivation of liberty or property or some other punishment by force of law. what is it to have a rule of law and not men? That the law actually be published and be published clearly in a way that is understandable to everyone that is subject to it. And so he goes through and he talks about, yes, the requirement of fair notice applied to all the law, but not just criminal law, also to statutes. It applied to civil law and not just to common law. And he says, yes, it is actually part of the requirement embedded in the constitutional requirement of due process. Then what he does is he goes on to answer certain questions, like, for example, are aliens, people who immigrate to this country, they're called aliens, they're not actually space aliens, but, aliens, are they also entitled to due process? And in fact, he disagreed with Thomas on this, and I didn't read Thomas's opinion, but he refers to it. Thomas was trying to argue that in the original meaning of the Constitution, that aliens didn't necessarily have the same right to due process as everybody else. And Gorsuch says, no, that we didn't necessarily have to grant certain rights to immigrants coming here under the Constitution. But once you grant them, for example, legal residency, that is something that you cannot deprive somebody of legal residency without due process of law, that due process applies to aliens. Imagine aliens are people too, that people who come to this country as immigrants are also aliens. The other thing that he talks about in terms of disagreeing, well, there's two other issues where he's sort of disagreeing with Thomas. One is there's this technical dispute among lawyers about what they call substantive due process and procedural due process, or just plain due process. And again, I didn't look at Thomas's opinion, but I am inferring from what I've read in Gorsuch's opinion that Thomas tried to make some sort of a substantive due process argument that would actually say that you shouldn't have to grant procedural due process rights to Dimaya in this case. So Gorsuch has this really great line about, whatever you think about whether there should be something separate called substantive due process versus procedural due process, certainly you're not going to say that it is consistent with, substantive due process to deprive somebody of a very basic procedural due process right. You're not going to use the doctrine of substantive due process to deprive somebody of basic procedure. God, if you want to read about substantive due process, I highly recommend Timothy Sandifer on this. He's got a section in his book called Conscience of the Constitution about it. But in essence, substantive due process is this doctrine that the court has sometimes used to sort of, protect what they would, say rights or privileges. Privileges and immunities clause is the one that they stopped looking at, and instead they tried to put this Band-Aid on called substantive due process. Essentially, if the court wants to protect you and doesn't see that it can do so in terms of just procedure alone, they brought in this idea of substantive due process. So maybe your right to contract could be protected through substantive due process if you couldn't be deprived, if you couldn't be protected under procedural due process. So they made this dichotomy between substance and procedure. And Gorsuch, he seems to sort of reject it, but he says, well, whatever you think about it, you're certainly not going to deprive somebody of the basic procedural rights to fair notice, to not have the law that's applied to you be vague. And so I think he was perplexed with the idea that that Thomas would use substantive due process, that doctrine that's usually meant to protect an individual's rights more, that you would use it to take away rights. It's a little bit strange. So there was that disagreement with Thomas. One more thing with Thomas, another disagreement that he had was that Thomas was trying to argue for a different way of interpreting the way that the law of the feds should interact with the law of the state. So as I said, there were two laws involved here. One is the federal immigration law that says you can deport this guy if he's guilty of various crimes, including crimes that by their nature include violence or involve violence, by their nature involve violence. That's the federal law. And then the state law said, the state law is the California law of burglary, which encompasses all sorts of things, which include things that aren't violent at all. Okay. And so the way that the court decided to analyze it is they use something called the ordinary case approach. So they asked, can you look at the quote, ordinary case of burglary and decide that the ordinary case of burglary involves violence in the way that is required, to make it work in conjunction with the federal law so you can deport this guy? That's really the question. That's the way that the court chose to interpret it. It's also the way that the government, again, who was the one who came to the Supreme Court in the first place, Sessions, it's the way that they said they agreed it should be interpreted. What is the ordinary case of California burglary? And does it involve, violence in the requisite way? By its nature involves violence, right? And so Gorsuch used that analysis, and he says, there is no ordinary case of California burglary. It involves such a wide range of things, many of them not violent at all. So therefore, if you try to use this combination of the federal law and the California law of burglary to deport this guy, sorry, we say it's void for vagueness. It goes by precedent. It goes by our interpretation of the original meaning of due process. You cannot deport this guy. It's unconstitutional to do that. That's the analysis he did. Thomas raises a different type of approach. He thinks that a different type of approach should be used. He thinks that you should look at the actual sort of burglary that Dimaya was involved in, guilty of. And if that type of California burglary involved violence, then you should deport him. So don't look at the ordinary case, but look at the actual case that, Dimaya was convicted of. And Gorsuch says, if the government hadn't conceded that we should look at the ordinary case, then I might have looked at that. But then he said, you don't necessarily know that you're going to go with what Thomas wanted. Thomas wanted, again, to look at exactly the type of burglary that Dimaya was guilty of. He says there's a third option, right? So you could have, what is the ordinary case of burglary? Let's try to see if there's an ordinary case of California burglary that we can make sense of and decide whether by its nature it involves violence. That's the analysis they went with. Thomas says, no, let's look at the actual case in front of us. And Gorsuch says, well, in the appropriate case, I'd be willing to entertain that as the approach we should use. But in addition, there's another type of approach we could use. And the other type of approach we could use is to say, in each and every case of California burglary, is there violence involved in the requisite way such that it works in conjunction with the federal immigration law and allows you to deport the guy? So he says, in the appropriate case, if the government hadn't conceded that we should use this ordinary case analysis, yeah, I'd look at other ways of analyzing this question. But A, that's not the case in front of us. And B, even if we were given the option of looking at different things because the government hadn't conceded a certain interpretation, still, I can think of another interpretation that would work against the government's position, would work to, again, uphold what the Ninth Circuit had done and protect Dimaya's legal residency status. So, and again, it's not that Dimaya is going to, fail to be punished for his burglary, right? The question is he going to be deported? That's the issue. And all that Gorsuch is saying is that for someone who is a legal resident, that person is entitled to not be deprived of that status without due process of law. And that due process of law requires, in part, that the laws that are going to be applied to you not be vague, that you be put on fair notice of the law that is going to subject you to penalties if you engage in certain conduct. So for me, I found this very heartening. I didn't necessarily myself, I don't know a whole ton about Gorsuch, but I didn't expect him to be a rubber stamp of Trump. I just don't think that anybody who's super intelligent is going to end up being a rubber stamp of Trump anyway. But I enjoyed his analysis, I would say, insofar as an originalist can be good, somebody who subscribes to original meaning. This is an excellently written opinion. And, the result is, yes, immigrants are people too, that they are also entitled to due process just like everybody else. And, and he makes the point, if the government wants to add to the list of crimes that would make somebody subject to deportation, all they have to do is be clearer about it. But instead, they listed a few different ones like rape and something else, and then they had a catch-all at the end. Let me see if I can find the language that he quotes here. Yeah, he says, the statute lists a number of specific crimes that can lead to a lawful residence removal. For example, murder, rape, and sexual abuse of a minor. He says, our ruling today does not touch this list. We address only the statute's residual clause, where Congress ended its own list and asked us to begin writing our own. And that's the thing. He says that Congress can add more crimes to the list, but it is not a judge's job. You do not want a government of men. The job of a judge is to apply the law, not to write the law. Let me see if I can. Yeah. Okay. So here's the residual language. It says the language before us requires conviction for an offense, quote, that by its nature involves a substantial risk of physical force. So that's the language of 18 USC 16B, which is the federal law at issue in this case. By its nature involves a substantial risk of physical force. And he was saying that that language is also amenable to the idea, by its nature, that it would have to be each and every instance of California burglary that would involve the substantial risk of physical force. And he says, no, that California burglary is such a huge catch-all. There's so many different types of conduct that fall under burglary that don't involve a substantial risk of physical force, that therefore it's void for vagueness. Now, the last question that I wanted to try to explain to you guys is, why did he write a concurrence and not go ahead and sign on with the majority opinion? And as I understand it, the reason he wrote a separate opinion is that he believes you should apply this same due process standard, this void for vagueness standard, regardless of the type of thing that the law is going to deprive you of. So the liberals on the court, they wanted to have a heightened standard of due process for somebody who was facing deportation. They thought, okay, facing deportation is such a deprivation of liberty that, it required a heightened standard of due process. And Gorsuch says, no way. There's so many things that the law deprives you of these days, and we need to have the same due process requirement, the same requirement of fair notice, the same requirement that the law not be vague as applied to you. Whether it's a civil penalty, they're going to confiscate your house. You know how they do with these takings? They come and they, confiscate your house and ask questions later and everything else. He talks about that extensively in here. So he refused to sign on to the majority because he's of the view that you have the same strict due process requirement, that fairness, that fair notice requires that you do this, even if the penalty is, quote, just civil. It's just your money. It's just your house. Government goes around seizing money in houses all the time. And it's ridiculous to say, okay, well, we're going to give special treatment to people who are facing deportation and not for others. So that's the good news vagueness. Now, why is this? I think that this sort of analysis, particularly from Gorsuch, where Gorsuch is saying, yes, we need to apply this high standard that requires that the law be clear, that it give you fair notice of the penalties that you're facing if you disobey the law, that you apply it across the board to civil penalties and criminal penalties, immigration law penalties alike, all of these things. I think that is auspicious for our ability to live our lives according to our own judgment. So definitely good news. It's not just that he went against Trump, but I also think it's good that he comes in there, even though he's been appointed by Trump, even though he's looking at a case where, this is an issue that Trump ran on. He ran on deporting criminals who immigrated here, some of them legally, some of them illegally, whatever. This guy was a legal resident, but that Trump supporters have want these guys out. And of course, what I posted about this on my social media feed, just crickets, because this is Gorsuch, right? This is the one that everybody says, you should be so happy we have Trump because Gorsuch. And here's Gorsuch ruling against, again, it's the Obama administration originally that brought this case, but it's Trump administration that's seen it through to the end. And that they're eager to take this position to get Dimaya out. It was just really, really nice to see. So that was a little bit long-winded for the first chunk of a news sandwich. I think the other ones will be shorter. Let me see if I've got some comments over here. The audio is clearer on YouTube than on Zoom. Zoom has some static, says Mark. I don't know if anybody else had that problem or not. If so, that's unfortunate. It doesn't seem possible that the audio would be clearer on YouTube because I'm actually feeding to YouTube via Zoom. So, now Nick says the judge you mentioned who said that the aliens in the original meaning didn't get the same rights or due procedure as citizens sounds evil. That's Thomas, right? Now, Thomas would just say he's making an original meaning argument, and it's really not him. It's, what the framers put in the Constitution. And, he is not reaching any judgment about what he thinks should be the case about them. It's just this original, I think he's an original meaning judge as well, but he might be more of a textualist. I'm not sure about Thomas. Yeah, but immigrants are people too, and for me, when I have a government that is acting to protect my rights, or a government that I think is a valid government is going to be restrained in its actions with respect to all human beings, not initiate force against any human being, use force only in self-defense and only to defend Americans. I got some people trolling me on Twitter today, caravan arrived and people are asking for asylum. See, I told you so. It's like, okay, so people aren't allowed to come to the United States and ask for asylum and come and stay here. They're guilty before proven innocent because they're immigrants. People are people are people are people. And I want government to be constrained in using force against people, using it only in retaliation. And yeah, there are certain things about having a country and you have a boundary. And so when people come in, you have to screen them and make sure that they don't mean you harm because they haven't been under your jurisdiction. You don't have a record on these people. You don't know who in the world they are. So yeah, do some sort of a screening. But other than that, why should we automatically assume that anybody who wants to come into our country means us harm? I don't see that. Why would Thomas say that with the various amendments, including this due process clause that applies to the states? Well, and then you're going to look at the original meaning, not just of the Constitution, but also of those amendments. Yeah, Thomas, you'd have to go and actually read Thomas's opinion. I gather it's rather long because the entire opinion of Sessions versus Dimaya, it was 96 pages. And 5 of that are the syllabus at the beginning, then 25 are the majority opinion, then you've got 19 for Gorsuch, and then you've got some more. So there's quite a lengthy opinion of Thomas that I'm sorry, I just didn't have time to. You guys, I have a vacation coming up, and I can sense in my mind that my brain is already starting to go into vacation mode, and I'm trying to be very disciplined and not do that. But when I was thinking, do I want to read Thomas as well this time? No, I'm just going to read Gorsuch and get a good handle on that and give you the best that I can on that and go on with it. But yeah, you could definitely go read the opinion. Again, it's Sessions versus Dimaya, Dimaya. And you could read what Thomas says. But he was arguing that aliens don't get the same due process rights that we do. And Gorsuch is saying, well, the Constitution doesn't necessarily require that we give that. But once we go ahead and we grant certain rights to them, so for instance, legal residency status, once someone has been granted legal residency status under our laws, then you cannot deprive a person of that without due process of law. Now, Jennifer asks, what does ignorance of the law is no excuse actually mean? So if you have been given fair notice, again, and the law has to be published and all the different requirements, you can't say, oh, well, I didn't know about it, and therefore I shouldn't be held subject to it. There are certain cases maybe in which ignorance of the law could be an excuse. So I think it's a little bit of an exaggeration to say that it's never an excuse. But in general, there's at least a huge body of law that you're not going to get away with saying, oh, gosh, I didn't know, for instance, that murder was illegal. That's generally what it means. But nonetheless, you must be given due process, and one of those requirements is fair notice, and that the law not be vague. If the law is vague, then if you say, I wasn't aware that I was going to, have my car impounded or whatever, if something happened, then yeah, ignorance of the law could be an excuse. Let me go over to Twitter. Oh, Lucas says, I agree that with those who say that the audio on Zoom is worse. That is fascinating. Huh. I don't know why it would be. Nicer quality on YouTube. So I wonder if YouTube uses some sort of a filter to equalize. Now, what could I do? There's one thing I can do to try to improve the quality on Zoom. I'm going to just do one little tweak. I'm not going to mess with this for a long time, guys. I don't want to get in the weeds. I do a little bit of a tweak because I guess there is the idea that if I'm speaking really loudly, I could be what they call oversaturating. I mean, it used to be if we were recording with actual physical tape and stuff, you talk about oversaturating the tape because too many decibels or whatever in the world. But obviously none of that applies. But those are the terms at which I think, because I'm old. Yeah, so I'm glad. I'm really glad that the quality on YouTube is holding up for you guys. But it is, Zoom is sending the signal over to YouTube. I just turned the volume down slightly, the output volume from my computer. So that might help the people over at Zoom a little bit. Maybe it will. Maybe it will. Okay, so I think I'm caught up for now. Some people got in the weeds yesterday somewhere. Okay, I don't know. There's something obviously that I missed. Oh, people are saying my makeup looks good today. Well, thank you. That's always nice. It could be also, depending on the kind of color of shirt that I wear, I think it really helps too. I'm starting to learn all of these things being on video. I think a color of shirt makes a difference. So let me get into the next story. So the first story is about vagueness. And yeah, it was good news. Why? Because in the law, we are requiring that the law not be vague, that if the government is going to use force against you, that it use it because of something you've been given fair notice of. And, we could talk about the substance of a law another time, but at least in terms of procedure, you need to be given fair notice. The law needs to be written clearly to say, if you do X, then you're going to suffer penalty Y. And everybody needs to be able to understand that. And Gorsuch said, in this case, it just didn't hold up. Now then, it's interesting. So in the law, our government's trying to get away with this vagueness, but out on Twitter, people are trying to pigeonhole you. And that's what the next article is about. And this is what the bad news is, right? Maybe I should spend very little time on the bad news so I can go into the good news again. I don't want to spend a long news sandwich here. I want to actually try to keep it to an hour. So let's see what I can do. The first chunk did require some legal analysis. So that'll be my excuse if I give the other thing short shrift. There's an article that I was made aware of by Benjamin. So thank you for this. And it was from the Wall Street Journal. Headline, "When the Twitter Mob Came for Me." And it's written by Kevin D. Williamson, who you may have known was hired to work for The Atlantic. He had previously worked for National Review. He's a conservative columnist. He had been hired to work for The Atlantic and then fired just a few days later. And the reason was that somebody had dug up an old tweet that he'd sent out there on the internet, and people were talking about abortion. And he believes that abortion is murder, like many religious conservatives do. And so, they were talking about, what should the penalty be and everything else if you believe that it's murder. And on this tweet, and it was a tweet that he'd sent out, I guess, 4 years ago. He said it was a 6-word tweet from 4 years ago. And let me see if I can find it. He had said essentially that instead of whatever the penalty was, what was it? Pro-lifers should not be taken seriously because unless they're willing to actually punish women who get abortions, etc., with long prison sentences. And he thinks this is a silly argument. So he says he responded with the words, "I have hanging more in mind," so that he's in favor of criminal punishment for abortion. Now, mind you, my disclaimer is I am in favor of a woman's right to choose an abortion. I would not consider myself a pro-abortionist because abortion is a surgical procedure that I should hope would take place as seldom as humanly possible. That any rational woman would take every reasonable step available to her to make sure that she would never have to have an abortion in the first place. But nonetheless, I think it should be there, and that it is an appropriate step for women to take in certain cases. So I'm in favor of the right to abortion. Nonetheless, I'm going to be sympathetic with Williamson here because what happened? So he says, "I have hanging more in mind," which, first of all, he didn't actually even really mean it. And people who know Williamson, if you dig into his writings, they actually know that he is skeptical of capital punishment. He actually doesn't believe in capital punishment at all. So, he says, yeah, it was kind of trollish and hostile and stuff, but he says that if you could read his writing, you would know that he was generally opposed to capital punishment. But did that stop anybody out there? No. As soon as he had been hired by The Atlantic, there was this campaign against him to get him fired. And it was funny because I guess when he was first hired by The Atlantic, it was Jeffrey Goldberg who hired him. He told him, he said, you're going to get a lot of hell for hiring me. And the guy says, oh, nah, it's no big deal and everything else. And sure enough, there was a ton of hell. There is an abortion rights group called NARAL, which organized protests against him, demanding that he not be permitted to publish in The Atlantic. And here's the most outrageous part. He says, and there was all this commentary, anti-Williamson commentary, all talking about this tweet about he's in favor of hanging women for abortion. He says, the remarkable fact about all this commentary on my supposedly horrifying views on abortion is that not a single writer from any of those famous publications took the time to ask me about the controversy. He says, the sole exception was a reporter from Vox. Did I think I was being portrayed accurately? Why did I make that outrageous statement? Did I really want to set up gallows despite my long-stated reservations about capital punishment? He says, those are questions that might have occurred to people in the business of asking questions. And then he says, in preparing his own writing here for the Wall Street Journal, he went back to Goldberg to verify conversations that he'd had with Goldberg just to make sure before he went to print. I'm skipping down a little bit, and he says, he was fired within days from the Atlantic. The Atlantic gave in to this, even though all of the people who were conducting this campaign against him were misrepresenting his view. He's actually not in favor of capital punishment. He is in favor of strict, some sort of punishment, some sort of prison sentences for women. And I would disagree with him and I'd argue with him about that, but he's not in favor of capital punishment. Nobody bothered to check that with him. And he was fired. And he goes on to say, he says, where my writing appears is not a very important or interesting question. What matters more is the issue of how the rage-fueled tribalism of social media, especially Twitter, has infected the op-ed pages and, to some extent, the rest of journalism. He says, Twitter is about offering markers of affiliation or markers of disaffiliation. The left shouts racist and the right shouts fake news. There isn't much that can be done about this other than treating social media with the low regard it deserves. End quote from him. So what does Twitter want to do to you? Twitter wants to categorize you. And I experienced this in my own limited way. As I said, I don't put myself in the category even of Williamson. Williamson says nobody cares who he is either, but, at least he was a well-known paid writer for National Review. I'm not even at that status yet, but, he says, I'm not in the club, and that's why they don't care about what I say. When I've gone on Tucker has labeled me in certain ways. And there were people who apparently watched it. And as soon as they digested whatever the label was, they decided that they're going to categorize me in a certain way and then start trolling me according to whoever those people are in that category. So yeah, they're very precise. Of course, they're not accurate when they throw you in the various categories. But, here we have in the law, we have the legislators trying to get away with vague things. And then we have in the realm of supposedly public discussion, where we're discussing ideas out there on social media and Twitter, they want to be very precise. And in fact, you're not allowed to deviate at all. Even if I go on to Tucker and I say something that doesn't sound like the normal feminist that most people have in mind is the feminist from Women's March, who is also a progressive and who wants special rights for women, who actually wants women to be granted certain values at the expense of the rights of other people, which of course that is not me. I'm an objectivist, so I don't believe in those things. But nonetheless, in the particular issue, I was taking the same side as the feminist, and he labeled me as a feminist. So what do? They all come out there and they just treat me as if I'm a leftist. I must be a Hillary supporter. I must check off all the things that they associate with that particular label. And Twitter's just so eager to categorize you and then vilify you according to that characterization. And it's like, you're not allowed in the realm of public discussion. This is not law, to deviate. I can understand where you'd say, okay, well, it may not be good law, but supposedly suppose a law was written and said, you can be in this category or this category. I mean, we have law, for example, that says whether you are a minor or whether you're an adult who's capable of consent or making certain types of contracts, right? And if you're younger than 18, then sorry, you're in the minor category. And if you're older than 18, then you are going to be held responsible for your contracts and your decisions. And maybe in many cases, that strict categorization, as clear as it is, it's not vague, but it doesn't fit the individual. There are people who are older than 18 who really shouldn't be trying to give consent to anything. Maybe with respect to certain things, like I wasn't so mature after the age of 18 sometimes, right? In college or whatever, you get a little wild. So, you don't always fit those categories, but nonetheless, law is someplace where you'd expect, okay, they have to draw lines, speed limit. What's the speed limit? Well, speed limit's 55, but in certain driving conditions, it is positively unsafe for you to be driving 55 in certain lanes. If you're not driving faster, you're actually a safety hazard because everybody else around you is going fast. So, as I said, the law can be clear, not vague, and not really fit the situation. One place where you want to be flexible and you don't want to try to put people into rigid categories is in the realm of discussing ideas. And so reading this piece from Williamson and, the vilification that he received, the unfair treatment that he received out there made me think even more that it's really important to avoid labels, for instance, if I get invited on Tucker again, I hope I get to go back on Tucker again. It's fun to have discussions with him about these issues, these important issues. I would really like to avoid a label, because you do see this. You see that Twitter wants to label you, and they want, as soon as they think they can label you, they want to ascribe to you, a whole series of views and trash you about them before they even know whether you actually hold those views at all. And they just took and ran with what Williamson said. Again, I disagree with him. And, would I necessarily even want the Atlantic? Would I say to the editor of the Atlantic, do you want him to be writing for you? I mean, maybe you want to have all different ideas and things like that. But yeah, to me, the whole whether abortion is murder debate is something that's going to have to happen, and have to happen in a better way. We've never really had the debate at a high level in this country. We ended up not having to have it. The Supreme Court let us punt that debate because of Roe versus Wade, and it's ended up having a lot of different consequences out there. We'll see if we're ever going to end up having it. In any event, social media. So what do? I integrated this in terms of news, right? When Williamson talks about how he was treated and how nobody even bothered to look at what his actual views were before they vilified him. I was looking at this in conjunction with Yaron Brooks' show earlier this week, where he was talking about how he conceives his goal for the future, what he's doing. He says, look, we're not going to achieve substantial cultural and certainly not political change in our lifetime, maybe some cultural change, but not political change within our lifetime. So he sees his goal as going all over the world, lecturing and finding and inspiring the people who are going to be the next objectivist intellectuals. So that's how he conceives his goal. And so when I took that, and I also looked at this, and I think about the ways that I have sometimes been vilified on Twitter, and if I go on Tucker and I get mislabeled, and people come on and they do this, and even forget the mislabeling, sometimes just for the actual views I express, people will come on. I think I have to be really clear about what my own goals are and what it is worth doing in terms of engaging and enduring and everything else in order to achieve those goals. So those of you who are patrons and show supporters, you're going to hear more about my thinking on this in the coming days. But I've given you some hints of where I'm wanting to redirect my focus. But it's really nasty and hostile out there. I'll give you an example as I'm going to go into the third story. I'm going to tell you this is good news, and you're not going to believe me. It's again in the category of vagueness. And the reason I put it in the category of vagueness is because it's Kanye West. He's out there tweeting, and I guess he just restarted on Twitter several days ago. And at the beginning, right from the first day, he was tweeting out these kind of vague statements about the nature of reality and consciousness, and some advice and different little snippets of stuff. And I'll give you a sample or two. But he then goes on a couple days later, and this is when it started to make the news. He said what he's doing is he's tweeting a book about philosophy. That's what he's doing in this. Now, he's been doing this for a few days now, several days. You can go to Kanye West's Twitter feed and judge for yourself. You can also, if you think you would enjoy it, look at some of the exchange that I've had. Not exchange, excuse me. He's not tweeting back to me. I've been answering some of his tweets out there. In any event, his statements are vague. Is it really philosophy? There are, he is actually saying little bits about what I would call each branch of philosophy, but it's certainly not systematic in any way, and it's vague and it's all over the place. What I think he's actually doing is I think he's trying to just sell his latest products, because what you'll see in his Twitter feed is he'll have these various vague musings about stuff. And as I said, a couple days into it, he actually said, what I'm doing is I'm tweeting a book on philosophy, and I'll do it whenever. He didn't say the spirit moves me, but just every so often when he's in the mood, he's going to keep tweeting this. And he talks about how he talks about the nature of time with his friend and all of this stuff. Why do I think this is good news, right? He's out there, he's tweeting a book on philosophy. Some of it, he says some good things that sound quite individualistic. He talks about choosing to follow what he says what you feel as opposed to the thoughts that everybody else puts in your head, So a little bit of individualism. He also talks about being motivated by love versus being motivated by fear, which of course is a positive thing. But then he's got some really hopeless things as well. Why would I think that this is good overall? And here's why. I mean, first of all, do I even know that he's really trying to tweet a book on philosophy? Not really. What I think he's doing, as I said, is I think he's trying to sell his album. I guess he's got an album coming up, and he's also got these products that he's selling, some shoes and other stuff. You can see pictures of stuff that he's designing in his feed. What I think is a good sign, and again, what is my standard, for good news? Good news is this auspicious for eventually having a society in which we're going to be able to conduct our own lives according to our own judgment? The reason I think this is good news is that he thinks philosophy will help him sell stuff. Now, he doesn't necessarily fully understand what philosophy is or what's required to actually do philosophy, as philosophers like to call it. But he thinks that tweeting about philosophy, calling it philosophy, is something that's going to help him sell his music and his products, which, if it actually starts people thinking about what philosophy really is, it starts a culture where you think that philosophy sells, that could be a positive development. I don't know where it's going to go. Again, this is early days, right? But here's Kanye West, and I know very little about Kanye West. People are saying, why are you engaging this guy? And everything. But one thing I will tell you is, I haven't engaged a whole ton, but I started the other day because I was sitting at the car shop and I had to get some work done that I hadn't anticipated. They had to go order the spark plugs that they needed by the way, my car runs so nice with new spark plugs. It's so smooth. But in any event, that, I'm sitting there waiting, and I see on Twitter, one of the top featured things is that Kanye's tweeting this book on philosophy. So, okay, I got to go look. So I answer. And whereas I'm getting some hostility, some people, I guess they look at me and it's like, oh, you know nothing about Kanye West. Who are you? One person just writes back to me, shut up. It's like, oh yeah, that's really helpful. We're going to have this discussion about philosophy and you just tell me to just shut up, as opposed. And I'm not engaging him in a bad way. I'm being critical, and sometimes I'm being supportive, and you can go and read the tweets that I sent to him and see, but, shut up, yeah. So there's a number of people who are coming back, but then I go back and forth with a couple of them, and some people who've never seen me before are coming and clicking like on some of my responses to him. And then, of course, I went this morning. I'll tell you just about the one this morning, and I'm going to leave you guys to go read this for yourself, and you can decide whether this is a fruitful use of time or not. But as I said, I'm taking it as potentially good news that there's somebody out there who thinks that philosophy is going to sell products and anything else. But let me give you the one that I found from him this morning. So yeah, this is it. Okay. So he doesn't have any punctuation or anything. Sharing is community, holding information is capitalism. And this is one of his big things that he's definitely struggling with this, because some people say that he definitely does believe in intellectual property rights, but he was tweeting in a number of tweets about, he thinks that he's been too jealous guarding his so-called creations or whatever. And maybe he needs to relax about it. That's the gist that you get of it. But he also, again, has very vague tweets. These are vague. And one of the tweets I wrote to him, I said, maybe you might want to edit so that the final product will represent your considered opinion, right? You might want to edit a little, but it's just vague stuff. Some of the tweets sound like he is opposed to granting full intellectual property rights, that we shouldn't be so concerned about protecting the rights of creators. And it's easy for him to say when whatever intellectual property he's already living off of right now has made him so much money that if he loses a little here or there, whatever. And then there's someone like me who's struggling, is just trying to say, okay, can I scrape up, the 1,000 subscribers that I need on YouTube and the hours and start to monetize and do all this, yeah, we're concerned to try to see if we can get credit where it's due, and everybody else. Justice requires that creators should be given the compensation that they deserve for their creations and everything else. So I did some pushback on that. But anyway, this morning he has this. This is the one that I found this morning. Sharing is community. And I'm pausing, even though he has no punctuation. Sharing is community. Holding information is capitalism. Holding information is capitalism. Now, what is capitalism about? Capitalism is about protecting the ability of free trade, not holding, but trading. And so here you are, right? Holding information is capitalism. No. So I say actually trading information is capitalism. And also the only type of community that can make human life better. A community in which we trade information is the only type of community that can make human life better. And the thing I was going to tell you that I was heartened by was that when I went on to the thread on Kanye's own tweet, so many people were coming back to him and saying, oh, does that mean you're just going to share your new album with us? And, you're a capitalist, and just pointing out that he's being a bit of a hypocrite here, and to think about this. No, obviously, I think he's out there trying to sell something with philosophy. And while I think that's a good sign, I'm going to go ahead and call him on his vagueness and everything else. And of course, he wants to be vague, right? He wants to be vague. What was the other one that I just answered the other day? I answered it with one word. He said, how did he say it? It's like, we're all slaves. Let me see. Yeah, no, we're all servants. He writes, we're all servants. And I said, just say of ? And there was a couple people who they were responding. One person responds, circumstances in our lives and our past and the natural order itself. And another person responds, God, but I think he's being deliberately vague because he wants to have the cachet of philosophy, which is this discipline that is supposed to provide answers about the nature of the universe and how we should live our life. This is something that he's sensing that people are feeling this need for philosophy out there. He wants to tap into that. And at the same time, he's putting out the vaguest sort of, cliche formulations, because then he isn't going to be pigeonholed in that classic Twitter way and trolled and everything else. And maybe he can appeal to the most people by not offending anybody and then sell his stuff. Obviously, when he says motivation by love versus motivation by fear, he doesn't mean exactly the same thing as an objectivist would when they're saying it. Although, in spirit, in some ways, maybe he's on the path. So as I said, I'm a cautious optimist about the good news. And I think the best news about that is that somebody who has been successful in the economy today thinks that philosophy is the thing that he wants to offer out there on Twitter. And a philosophy, again, one of the things that he says in the tweet is, there's no publicist and there's no agent going to tell me what to put in these tweets and everything. So it's him, deciding what to say for himself, a very individualist approach to it. He thinks that's going to sell, that's going to sell everything. And if he does, I think that that's a good sign. Then the question is, can we tap into that the thing that he's sensing as a marketer? Can we tap into that and feed people some of the actual good ideas that are going to improve the world and improve life for all of us? Now let's see. Oh, Cardi B is somebody else I should look into, says Jay over here at Zoom. A tax rant that Cardi B gave, a sad sliver of hope for the culture as well. It would be nice. We're all servants to Kanye's vagueness. Yeah, we're not servants to it. We'll see. We'll see. It's going to be interesting to see what he comes up with. He's a musician, not just a shoe marketer. I think there's some tradition of musicians using and embracing bits of usually bad philosophy. Yeah, of course they do that. The Cardi B one was great. Okay, so I'm going to have to go check out Cardi B as well. That would be good. I won't do that in another news sandwich. I'll try not to duplicate for you guys or get repetitive. Let me go back over to YouTube. And yeah, Mark says, I do a lot of marketing. It really is an art form. But and Mark, I'm talking to you over here on YouTube. Don't you think it is a good sign? Yeah, I'm scrolling up in an earlier comments. Mark is saying, yes, we can tap into it. That would be really great if we can. Someone says he's entertaining himself. Could be. Laissez-faire maximizes communication. That's the thing. The culture on Twitter can be so divisive. And as I said, even as I'm coming in there and courteously having, I'm not having a discussion with Kanye, but because he's not answering, and I don't know if he's answering anybody. I didn't see whether he's answering. I should go and look and see if he's responding to anybody about this, but he's certainly not responding to me. Even I'm just courteously answering and challenging, asking follow-up questions. And this guy just writes back, shut up. Like, we're not supposed to have a discourse. We're all supposed to stay in our little boxes and not try to have a meaningful discussion across bubble boundaries or whatever it is. That's the sad part. We'll navigate it all. I think, as I'm going to have a vacation a little bit over a week. I'm going to take about 6 days. And you know how vacations do. They help you consolidate what's important to you. You come back and you reprioritize. I'm looking forward to that. My response to the shut up was nice. I forget exactly what I said to the person. I said that this didn't seem like it was in the spirit of the discussion that Kanye had initiated, something like that, right? That the shut up wasn't consistent with that. And you know what the guy comes back with? He said, well, something like, oh, well, I bet you can't shut up. And actually it's true. I mean, here I am. Look, it's 12 after 12 Pacific time. I've been talking longer than I had intended. So he's right. I do. I talk a lot. Anyway, I'm going to let you guys go. I hope you enjoy the rest of your Saturday. I really appreciate that you decided to join me here today. I hope that you enjoyed my little news sandwich format, and we'll be doing some more of that. Think about ideas about how we can maybe make social media useful, or do we think that we need to give up on social media entirely? Again, that was the meat of the news sandwich here is, should we do what Williamson said that we should do, which is relegate social media to what he called the low status that it deserves? He says there isn't much that can be done about this other than treating social media with the low regard it deserves. Should we do that, or should I go on Twitter and engage somebody like Kanye if I see a sliver of hope? Questions like that. Let's think about it. Let's have a continued discussion. I will be back on Wednesday with a show of some format. All of you patrons and show supporters, please send me your questions. And as I said, if I get there on the live show and I don't have enough questions to fill the whole time and stuff, I will be looking both at my live Zoom feed. So if you haven't thought of a question and you think of one spontaneously, I'll go ahead and take it. I'll take priority from Zoom, and then I'll also take some questions from YouTube as well. So thanks, everybody. You guys take care. Thanks to everyone, again, who joining me in Zoom, the patrons and show supporters who make this possible. I really appreciate it. If you've been thinking of becoming a patron, I encourage you, come over to Patreon, join up, And there are little perks that you get for that. Go ahead and read about it. Check it out. Take care, everybody. I'm going to end now, and I'll see you Wednesday.